It's as close to time travel as we're gonna get. This week in music history with Marty Miller.
The idea of this little podcast is very, very simple. We go through a week of music history in less than 10 minutes, and it's virtual time travel. This week, we're looking at March 30th until April 3rd. How are you? My name is Marty. Thank you for being here. We'll be looking at the year 2000, when somebody was going back to school, somewhat more famous than when he left.
When he left this school as a fairly undistinguished pupil.
And in 1984, when your father decides you won't see your next birthday.
Shot to death on the eve of his 45th birthday.
And Bob Dylan accepts his prize in 2017 eventually.
But I hope what I say will be worthwhile and purposeful.
This week in music history with Marty Miller.
It was this week back in 1976 that the Sex Pistols played their very first show in London, sounding pretty much as you'd expect them to sound. This week in 2000, Mick Jagger was making a visit to his old school. He opened up the new art centre that had been named after him at Dartford Grammar. Jagger said that he spent the worst years of his life at that school.
Back at his old grammar school, where they've named a new art centre after him. Jerry Hall and 3 of his 4 children at his side. It was a far cry from the averagely intelligent but easily distracted schoolboy who was a member of the basketball team. His desire to be a rock musician was dismissed as a joke. Little can Mick Jagger have imagined when he left this school as a fairly undistinguished pupil, he'd return nearly 40 years later to the sound of music that's made him famous the world over.
In 1949 this week, RCA Victor introduced the 45 RPM single record, which had been in development since 1940. This 7-inch plastic disc was designed to compete with the long-playing record introduced by rival record company Columbia a year earlier.
You're listening to The Sleeping Beauty, Tchaikovsky's beautiful ballet music, on the new distortion-free RCA Victor 45 RPM records. Listen, compare, and you too will agree that RCA Victor's 45 RPM record is the finest and best ever made.
This week back in 1967, Jimi Hendrix got a box of matches and decided to set fire to his guitar live on stage. For the first time, he did this a couple of times. He was appearing at the Astoria in London. And by the way, that Fender Stratocaster that had been burned by Hendrix sold for 280 grand in 2008 at a rock memorabilia auction. Do you want to hear what a dying on fire guitar sounds like? This week in 1984, Marvin Gaye was shot dead by his father at his parents' home in Los Angeles, California. News reports at the time.
Singer Marvin Gaye was shot to death on the eve of his 45th birthday. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was booked on suspicion of murder and ordered to undergo psychiatric tests.
In the 60s, there was a great band called the Zombies, and a member of the Zombies was a fella called Paul Atkinson. He was the guitarist, and in 2004, he died age 58, liver and kidney disease. After being in the Zombies, he became an A&R man, a record executive working for Columbia and RCA. He is the bloke that's responsible for signing and discovering bands like Mr. Mister, Judas Priest. Best of all, ABBA. But musically, Paul Atkinson on this great Zombies record.
Time of the season for loving.
It was 2017 this week, after months of uncertainty and a little bit of controversy, that Bob Dylan finally accepted his 2016 Nobel Prize in Literature. He made a speech about that.
When I received the Nobel Prize for Literature, I got to wondering exactly how my songs related to literature. I wanted to reflect on it and see where the connection was. I'm going to try to articulate that to you, and most likely it will go in a roundabout way. but I hope what I say will be worthwhile and purposeful.
Back in 1970 this week, Phil Spector completed final editing and mixing for the Beatles' Let It Be album, 16 months after it had begun. I tell you, far from the George Martin days when you would get the boys in the studio, record, mix it down and release 4 albums in one afternoon. Of course, that actually never happened. The Beatles feeling messy in the studio.
When I was younger, so much younger than today, I never needed anybody's help in any. But now these days I'm not so self-assured. Now I find I change my mind and open up the door. Help me!
Speaking about bands in studios, this week in 1990, Nirvana went into a studio in Wisconsin to start work on demo versions of songs like this, which would become something very well known. And finally, this week in 1969, Jim Morrison turned himself into the FBI in Los Angeles. He was charged on 6 charges of lewd behaviour and public exposure at a concert in Miami, March 2nd of 1969. He was later released on $2,000 bail, and this was where all of the trouble started.
President of the Greater Miami Crime Commission, I'm calling upon the Dade County Grand Jury and the State Attorney's Office to immediately take criminal action against those that were responsible for the deplorable condition and situation that occurred at the Dade County Auditorium this past weekend, when the group known as the Doors, the rock and roll group, attempted to precipitate a riot.
And that is a look at this week in music history. That is March 30th to April 3rd. My name is Marty Miller. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Let's do it all again next week.
Zipping through a week in a matter of minutes. This week in music history, the podcast.